Good afternoon. My name is Prakash Nair. I'm the President and CEO of Education Design International. Over the past 20 years, I've had the good fortune to work on projects distributed across 52 countries on 6 continents. So before I get into this presentation, let me just pull up my slide deck. So you'll notice the title of my talk today, which is Transforming Education by Design. The word design is intended to have 2 meanings. One, we're obviously talking about spaces, learning spaces and architecture, which is design. But design also has a different meaning, and that is intention. And what I'm saying is that if you want to transform education, we need to have intention behind it. Today, the vast majority of education, and especially school buildings, looks exactly the way it looked 75, one might even argue over 100 years ago. So we are not putting any intention into the design of our new schools. Rather, we are repeating a mental model that we are familiar with. So here's the danger to not changing. The learning has escaped the boundaries of the school building, whereas schools continue to do the things that they used to do, as I said, going back 100 years. So if we do not change school learning, which is kind of flatlining, as you can see, then the relevance of school, the reason why we send our children to school, is going to become more and more questionable. Because if learning were the real purpose of going to school, then we don't really need to be in school to learn. So what I'm saying is that we need to change this. We need to change it by making school learning more meaningful. We want the time that students spend in school to have more meaning than what they do today. So what do I mean by more meaning? What I'm talking about is that the schools are continuing to follow what we call a hierarchical model, a top-down model, where all the power is at the highest end of the hierarchy, and students and teachers at the lowest end hold very, very little power. So they are trapped by the system and are jumping through the hoops that the system has set up for them. Whereas the open network, which is what students and teachers face immediately upon exiting the school building, is where we connect with people, resources, information as needed, when needed. So what we really need to do is to see if we can make school learning look more like the open network model that we are familiar with outside of school. And the reason for doing this, beyond the fact that the world has of course changed in the last 100 years, is that today we are in really the heart of the 4th industrial revolution. Now this revolution is evolving very, very, very fast. And as you can see, there are a number of elements to this revolution, starting with artificial intelligence. And so the education that our children needs to include things like critical thinking, very, very important, complex problem solving, because most of the world's problems that our children are going to inherit are going to be much more complex than the ones that we were dealing with, and of course, creativity. So without those 3 primary skills, our students have a very little chance of being successful in the coming age. But before we even get to that, there are certain things that we want, certain fundamentals that we need to meet. All human beings have a need to determine their own life. We call it self-determination theory. So let's start with our basic human needs. What is self-determination theory? It has 3 components to it. The first component is autonomy. That is our need to be independent and do things on our own. And to feel that we are in charge of our own life. Everybody has that need. Second is competence. We all want to be good at what we do. So competence is very important. We need to give students an opportunity to achieve mastery at whatever it is that they're doing. And third, relatedness. Now, relatedness doesn't refer only to relationships, which are of course very, very important, relationships with other human beings, but it also means that a student feels connected, related to community, related to the environment, and feels that they're part of something larger than themselves. So what is holding reform back? Basically, the problem is that we are tied to what we call a time and space bound paradigm of education. And by that, what I mean is that schools are rigidly organized according to a specific timetable, and their students are rigidly organized according to a specific space, and for the most part, that space is the classroom. And this is severely limiting in terms of how we can change our education system. And this model that I'm talking about goes back, as you can see, over 100 years ago. And we're continuing the model, maybe in slightly newer buildings, but the fundamental model has not changed. So what we are trapped in is this model we call teacher-centered learning, where the teacher is in charge and the students are passive. Real learning happens when students take more control of their life. I talked to you about self-determination theory. If students don't have autonomy, they don't achieve competence, and they don't have relatedness, it won't work. And classrooms do not build self-determination, do not support the self-determination theory. So what happened during the pandemic, during COVID-19, was that this sort of rigid model of teacher-directed education became even more prevalent as schools doubled down on a failed model of education. So now with social distancing, students are able to do even less with each other than they were able to do under the old model. So as you can see, all around the world, I've just given you a few countries here to show you what's been happening. It's the same. Some more extreme than others. Now, when students were not in school, they were at home, sitting in front of screens, trying to duplicate in classes, at home, the experience that they would have had in a classroom. And as I said to you, the classroom experience wasn't that great to start with. And so taking this distance learning did not really do much for education. If anything, I would say push education back. I'm not saying distance learning isn't good. What we're doing today is distance learning. But distance learning should not be an opportunity to just copy what was happening in the classroom. So what we need is a student-centered model. This is what we should be aiming for. And this is not something new. I mean, it is close to 100 years of educators almost begging to change schools, to make them more humane, make them places where students are actually in charge of their own learning, which is what really, if you look at the research on how we learn, it's only by doing, by making mistakes, and by exploring and giving vent to our curiosity that real learning happens. So in student-centered learning, there are 4 key components. The first component is called personalized learning, and that simply means that all students are different. They are going to go on to different career and life trajectories. So why are we subjecting them to the exact same process while they are in school? We need to understand and recognize their individuality, their differences, and we need to create an education system where every student feels that they have a personalized experience. I'm not saying there won't be some kind of a standard curriculum which everybody might be required to master, but beyond that, there has to be a significant amount of personalization. Competency-based goes back to the self-determination theory, which is that we need to ensure that students feel they are competent at whatever they're doing. We need to encourage them and support them until they are able to achieve mastery. We also need to recognize that learning happens anytime, anywhere. So we shouldn't assume that learning begins and ends with the school building. And finally, we need to give students a voice in their own learning. They need to have a say. And so that's what student-owned learning means. Students are going to be far more interested in learning when they have had some role in creating that learning experience. Now, if you look at the ways in which learning can happen in school, there are these 20 modalities of learning, and I've identified here 10, and I'll show you on the next slide 10 more. And you can quickly glance through them to see that this is a wide variety of things that we can and should encourage in schools. These are actually pictures from schools. But the problem comes in because when you start looking at these 20 modalities, look closely at them, and then step back and say, wow, these are great ways in which students should be learning, because most of them, as you can see, are places where students are taking the initiative as opposed to the teacher, even though lecture is a perfectly legitimate form of learning. The problem comes in that much of what I'm showing you here is almost impossible to do in the classroom. So now, if you're trapping students in classrooms for most of the day and telling them, we want you to learn, that learning is going to be not as sophisticated as we want it to be, because the classroom provides certain, it prohibits certain kinds of learning. And the reason is simple, because the physical school building doesn't allow students to work on projects. It doesn't allow teachers to collaborate. And you see that black line in the middle? That black line represents the traditional school building. So what I'm saying is that if we are interested in a modern education, we need a modern school design. Essentially, it's kind of like trying to say, I can do all the technology that I do today from a 1982 Apple IIe computer. Obviously, we know we cannot. So the hardware has a significant impact on the software. The software is education, and the hardware is the school building. So again, if you look at the image on the left here, the teacher in front of the room, classroom with a group of students in a hallway, it really stops teacher collaboration. It makes the pedagogy very teacher-centered. It makes the curriculum isolated. So you might have mathematics in one room, then science in another room, and English in another room. So it's not possible to do interdisciplinary work in a room, in a setting like this. If you just open up the wall between two rooms, you can begin to see how things begin to improve somewhat. But we want to take this all the way. We want to create something called a learning community, in which the teachers work together in a suite. As you can see, the teachers are working as a team, and there's a variety of spaces in which different kinds of learning can happen. So now those 20 modalities of learning can happen. And if you look on the right, that's the software. You can see that teachers can work in teams. The work can be very student directed as opposed to just teacher directed. The curriculum can be integrated, and the sense of community extends beyond the classroom. So now students are friends with probably 100 other students, and every teacher knows every student personally by name. So I'm going to quickly flash through these to show you how much superior the learning community is compared to the classroom. See, in the classroom, teachers work independently. And there's research that shows that when teachers collaborate, student achievement goes up significantly. So we want to create opportunities for teachers to work collaboratively. Then in classroom is good for theory because it's a direct instruction model, but the learning community is good for practice. You only get good at the things that you practice. You don't get good at the things that you listen to. Classroom, you're always trapped with others. You don't have a place to escape. Learning communities, there's space for independent study, quiet reflection, and everybody needs that, not just adults. Classrooms tend to centralize technology. With technology as mobile as it is today, it makes no sense that technology should be trapped in classrooms when they can be freed up, and students can take technology and go anywhere in the school. So I think that it's important to understand that in today's world, you want technology to be mobile, thereby you want students to be mobile. And we have this age-based grouping, which has now become part of the model that we have all accepted. There's no research that shows that it's a good model. Inter-age groupings are actually far better, where older students can actually mentor younger children. And so that's possible in a learning community. And of course, if you look at the design itself from an architectural standpoint, it's very inefficient because you're wasting a lot of space in corridors. Sometimes as much as 30% of the space is wasted in unusable spaces. Whereas the image on the right, which is the American Embassy School in New Delhi, shows how we converted a cells and bells design. We call it cells and bells because students start their school in a typical cell, and then the bell goes off and they move to another identical cell. Whereas here, as you can see, we remove the corridor, and we remove the corridor, we could create many more opportunities for learning, going back to those 20 modalities. Now, if you look at this list, and it is based upon research coming out of Harvard and Cornell universities, both Ivy League schools in the United States, you can see how the classroom-based model permits very few of those modes of learning to happen. And I mentioned this earlier. We are saying that about 4 forms of learning can happen in a classroom, whereas the learning community can accommodate as much as 19 forms of learning. Now, of course, as the individual teacher, if you give him or her lots and lots of space and money, they can furnish their so-called classroom to feel more like a learning community. But at the end of the day, first of all, this is not going to be possible because most teachers don't have this luxury of space or money. And second, even in this model, the teacher is still isolated and the students are isolated, meaning that you're not going to do interdisciplinary work. And second, teachers are not collaborating with each other. So this is unfortunately the more common and prevalent model, whereas a teacher with her own desk and there's a bunch of students sitting either together like this or maybe in small groups. It doesn't matter, it's still a classroom. So what we want to do is we want to change this ratio of teachers and students. In classrooms, we're always trapped in 1:25. It could be 1:35, it doesn't matter. So we are trapped in that model. There's always the same number of teachers, the same number of students. Whereas in the learning community, by combining that space and creating a variety of spaces, teacher-student ratio can vary throughout the school day. So if a teacher wants to spend time one-on-one with a student, that's possible. If a teacher wants to spend time with 5 students, that's possible, or 10 students. Or if there's a lecture that all 100, 125 students have written, that's possible as well. So that's the difference between the classroom model and the learning community model. So here's an example of what a teacher office might look like. And here's another example. And this is a good example because here the teachers are working while class is in session. And there's a help desk that students can come and ask for help. This is the Singapore American School. So here is an example of how a traditional space can be converted to a learning community. So classroom and corridor model goes to the learning community. So I'm taking here a typical classroom and corridor model, selecting a small part of that and showing you how it can be completely converted into a contemporary learning environment, probably as close within a matter of a couple of weeks, few weeks. So you have these active learning studios, you have small group and seminar rooms, you have teacher collaboration areas, you have a common space for variety of activities, you have an area to do projects, design projects, and then you have an area to build projects. Then of course you can go outside as well. We want to have as much as possible outdoor connections. Now, if you were to walk through this space, you will see the variety of spaces and the variety of learning opportunities that it presents. So, for example, you have the small group room here. As you go, you can see writable surfaces. This is the big common space that I told you about with technology and breakout spaces like that. And then you have LED lighting, as you can see. Learning studios have operable doors that can open up when the students are not in direct instruction mode. Then from there, they can go to the project commons where they can design a variety of things. And from there, they can go in and actually build those things in the project studio. And if they need to take that learning outside, that garage door opens up and then you can take the learning outside. So as you can see, this is a far superior model to just having a series of boring classrooms and a corridor. So this model is actually being used quite extensively around the world. This is one of the award-winning projects that my company that I was working with won, and it's called the McConnell Award. And this is actually a public school. And you can see here that this doesn't look like a typical government school. It's actually done in partnership with a local university, Clemson, as well as local companies like Goodyear and BMW. And as you can see, this is not our grandfather's school, and it shouldn't be. Why should our children study in environments that look like that? Now, here's an example of what that learning community I was telling you about looks like when it's completely built. So you can see these are garage doors that open up from the learning studio, so students can spill out into this space. And then there's a seminar room. There's an area for distance learning and technology-based learning. There's a teacher collaboration suite. And there's also places for students to do hands-on work, a big laboratory in every learning community. I'm going to take you through some images of what learning community-based schools look like. And here's some images. Here's an image. This is a plaza that students come into. This is Anne Frank Inspire Academy in Texas. This is a school I worked on in Florida. This is again that American Embassy School. This is a school in St. Petersburg, Florida. And this is that same school. As you can see, students are able to go outside. And this is something that we should encourage. As much as possible, we want to give students an opportunity to be outside. Students don't have to be sitting in classrooms in order to learn. And even when they are together, they don't all have to be doing the same thing. They can be doing different things, even in the same environment. And the adult role, as you can see, is to be a guide, a mentor, and to work one-on-one with students, as the case might be. And even young children are perfectly capable of self-directing. They don't need to be constantly told what to do. So our learning spaces encourage that kind of self-reflection, self-direction. So how does it all fit in from the perspective of the teacher? So basically, the teacher's role has to change, obviously. So all the things that I'm talking to you about only work if we do a significant amount of teacher professional development. So Heidi Hayes Jacobs, a colleague of mine that I work with, and Marie Alcock have written this book, Bold Moves, and in there they describe 6 new roles for the teacher. And I'm not going to read them to you, but as you look at them, the teacher as innovative designer. So these are not the kind of roles that teachers have had to play in the past. But today, the demands are greater because students can get content very freely just on their smartphone. So you don't need a teacher for that. You need a teacher to do things to truly support students in this new model of teaching and learning. So I'm going to show you one case study from Boulder Valley School District. And I'm showing you this because this is an entire a school district with a number of different schools. So they had 31,000 students, 56 schools, and they ended up having $575 million to spend, which included several new schools and also lots and lots of renovation projects. So I was fortunate to work on this with this group, and essentially the first thing I did was to take a look at what they currently had. And this is what they had. These schools weren't any different than the ones that I would have seen all around the world. Unfortunately, this is our expectations for schools is not so great, as you can see. And this, even at all grade levels, the spaces were not good, to put it simply. And of course, corridors, we call them cells and bells, as I said, and large cafeterias like this. So we started a series of workshops with the school community, including teachers, leadership, and parents and students. And we ended up doing a discovery report to truly understand what each school stood for, to understand their specific ethos. So I'm going to flash through some of the work that we did. And essentially the important thing was we came up with these 6 innovation guiding principles. And this is what drove everything that came after. So you can see students had a big voice in this project. We had them contribute significantly to it. When the school was about to be constructed, we had students come out and do the groundbreaking. And this is the finished product. The images kind of tell you the story. This is what a learning suite looks like, where 2 classrooms work together as a suite of rooms where the teachers can then collaborate with each other. And you can see many modes of learning are happening here. This is a great space because you can see all the different kinds of learning that can happen in a space like this. It's a cafe, it's an art space, it's a community space, it's a performance space. At the same time, it's also a beautiful space. It's aesthetically pleasing. And here's another project, the one that I was just showing you. This is what we call the welcoming, the same background that I have, as you can see. This is the welcoming entry to the school. It's called a family room. And behind it is the Curiosity Center. And this is what their learning studios look like. This is what the Curiosity Center looks like. This is a high school. This is what the image of the space before. And this is that same space after. And as you can see, this is now a student center, completely run by students. You don't see any adults here. Again, the idea is that we know that students are capable. We want to give them opportunities to succeed. This is what the corridor looks like before the renovation at one of the old other schools that we did. This was an existing school, and this is again before picture and after. You can see again, trying to take advantage of all the spaces in the school. There's something called Pathfinders, which is smaller projects. I just showed you a big project. Smaller projects are things that you can do over a few weeks. So in this school in New York, we took, in Chappaqua, we took rooms that look like this at Horace Greeley High School, a very top performing high school. This is exactly the picture that you might expect to see 50 years ago. And we converted it over a summer to enable a variety of learning activities, as I was telling you about those learning modalities. And you can see the different space here. You don't have those typical classrooms anymore. Now, as you go through these images, just visualize in your head, could this have happened in a classroom? And the answer to all these images is no. That's the reason we need to get rid of classrooms. We need to create a variety of rich, textured learning spaces that you simply cannot do in a classroom setting. So as you look at these pictures, imagine trying to do this in a classroom. Obviously not possible. And remember, these used to be 3 classrooms. That's what we did. We took 3 classrooms and we stopped it. I mean, we changed it. So we had formal and informal spaces, places where students and teachers could have more informal conversations as opposed to just lectures. Remember what I told you about the learning curve? Well, we can do better than just making the school learning try to catch up with the outside learning. I think the better alternative, and this actually came about through COVID in some ways, is to see if there's some way to blend this idea that learning happens beyond the school with all the learning that happens within the school, and see if we can bring those 2 things together. And that would be the ideal situation where school learning isn't competing with the world outside school, but rather collaborating with it. And so education becomes a holistic enterprise that doesn't begin and end with the school, but the school doesn't sit in isolation and try to force students to go through a process that's been outdated for, as I said, decades. Rather, it embraces change. It embraces the work that happens outside school. And yes, school learning can become very relevant, very important, because that's the place where you can be physically present with others, your colleagues, your teachers. But we're not going there as a sole place for learning. So this model, I think, is what's going to take off, I'm hoping, after COVID-19. If you want more information about everything that I've said, you can go to our books. Here are 3 of them. And these are all available on Amazon and other sources. So if you have any questions, I would also encourage you to write to me and at Prakash at educationdesign.com, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions. It was really a privilege for me to talk to you, and I hope I'll be able to see you in person. I would much prefer to do this in person, but obviously that was not possible because of the pandemic, which we hope is on the way out. And so I look forward to seeing all of you at some point in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.